easy to be cynical about the state of Hollywood right now. Studios would rather grind the industry to a standstill than pay their writers fairly, all the while treating the art those writers help create like disposable consumer products. Mid-budget films have all but ceased to exist, and anything not based on a piece of existing IP is seemingly not too far behind. Meanwhile, general audiences fed on a steady diet of empty nostalgia have become chronically challenge-averse, demanding little more than the opportunity to be reminded of things they've seen before. Nothing epitomizes pop culture's current obsession with its past more than the rise of the legacy sequel, IP necromancy designed to capitalize on our affinity for dead franchises by raising them from the dead. The ultimate commodification of nostalgia. And don't get me wrong, legacy sequels can be meaningful explorations of why we fell in love with a particular story in the first place. But more often than not, these films exist first and foremost to revamp an expired brand. Worse still, their proliferation has effectively killed the idea that the stories we love can ever just be over. Endings are no longer periods, but commas. Impermanent pauses until the next entry comes along to pick up where the previous left off. With so many legacy sequels as of late, it'd be pretty easy to write off Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny as just another cynical attempt to resurrect a beloved series for a quick buck. Disney and Lucasfilm dragging Indiana Jones out of retirement for a belated sequel, 15 years after his previous belated sequel. And indeed, many have been quick to level this exact criticism against the film. But while I empathize with their skepticism, it feels a tad misplaced here, because somehow, against all odds, Dial of Destiny manages to be the complete opposite. The rare legacy sequel content with simply saying goodbye, telling a poignant story about our relationship with nostalgia and how attempts to cling to the past prevent us from living in the present. To put it simply, James Mangold knocked it out of the fucking park, delivering a thrilling and resonant swan song to one of the greatest heroes in all of cinema. No small feat when you consider the shoes he had to fill. Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, two titans of industry, stepped back from their respective roles as writer and director this time around to instead serve as executive producers. And while I'd be lying if I said their absence wasn't felt on some level, Mangold's steady hand guides the ship with incredible zeal. He's no Spielberg, but then again, who is? But one of the film's greatest strengths is Mangold's ability to recognize that about himself. Dial of Destiny is steeped in the visual language of Indiana Jones that Spielberg established, but it thankfully doesn't devolve into a facsimile of a Spielberg movie. Mangold brings his own voice to the project, imbuing the film with a cynicism and introspection that recalls his past works like Logan and Copland. And while the film isn't quite as tight as Spielberg's 4 efforts, clocking in at just under 2.5 hours, that time never feels wasted. And while your mileage may vary with its slower pace, I personally appreciate its willingness to linger in quieter moments. The film has different ambitions than its lighter, brisker siblings, and that's among one of my favorite things about it. Mangold plays with the audience's expectations of an Indiana Jones film, subverting tropes and indulging in others, all without ever feeling beholden to a pre-established formula. This was made evident most immediately. As in, the opening logos immediately. Because as silly as it sounds, I knew we were in safe hands the moment the Lucasfilm logo cross-faded into a rectangular lock on the back of a truck. This little homage to the way the Paramount logo would fade into a mountain in the original films probably doesn't seem at all that significant, but it assured me that although the filmmakers were keenly aware of the traditions established by those previous films, they were equally willing to play with those expectations. And play with expectations the film does, taking big conceptual swings on everything from its more meditative tone and central time travel conceit. And unlike Dial of Destiny's most immediate predecessor, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, a film that also took big swings, these risks largely pay off because Mangold and his co-writers, Jez and John Henry Butterworth, commit to them. Unlike Crystal Skull's pivot away from its 50s sci-fi homage in the second half or unresolved McCarthy subplot, Dial of Destiny doesn't equivocate or deal in half measures. You get the sense everyone involved believed in the direction they were taking the story, and it soars as a result of that confidence. This confidence also gives the film an edge that was sorely lacking from the mostly toothless Crystal Skull, where that film felt like old men revisiting their heyday with less of a stomach for the gleeful violence and moral ambiguity those films had entailed. Dial of Destiny hews much closer to the spirit of those original 3 entries, reveling in the weight and carnage and moral grayness of Indy's world. The characters are compromised and hedonistic, and the action is kinetic and violent, as it should be. The grit is reflected in the look of the film as well. The warm palette and stark shadows harkens back to the high contrast look of the original films, imbuing each location with a foreboding sense of peril, an impression amplified by Adam Stockhausen's impeccable production design that feels at once a part of Indy's world and a reminder that it isn't the same world he once knew. This passage of time also informs John Williams' brilliant score, which opens with a kind of greatest hits medley of classic motifs from throughout the series before transitioning to a more Bernard Herrmann-esque sound that evokes the 60s conspiracy thrillers the film is drawing on in its first act. Williams literally never misses in anything that he ever does, but especially the Indy films. But this is an especially strong note to go out on, making for arguably his best work since The Last Jedi, and before that, probably the early 2000s. A lot of the work here feels reminiscent of that era of Williams, which is my personal favorite era of John Williams. However, for all the artistry Mangold and his collaborators bring to the film, what anchors it to the spirit of its predecessors more than anything else is Indiana Jones himself, Harrison Ford. Spielberg and Lucas may be gone, but the beating heart of the franchise is kept intact by Ford, the essential ingredient of the original films, given arguably a bit more creative agency than he ever has been. By all accounts, Harrison is the one who made this film happen, and that passion for not only the story, but the character it lovingly farewells is the creative engine that drives the entire thing, delivering a soulful, nuanced performance, legitimately one of his best ever, if you can even believe that. Ford invigorates every aspect of the film and imbues it with a sense of purpose and vision. Dial of Destiny could have very easily been just another corporate product, a soulless legacy sequel going through the motions to revive a dead franchise, but instead, it feels like a well-earned epilogue to one of the greatest action franchises of all time. A deeply personal story about growing old that loves and honors what came before it without falling into facile reverence, a distinction that makes all the difference. When it was first announced that Indy would once again be squaring off against the Nazi villains in Dial of Destiny, I admit I was a bit skeptical. Although there are few greater cinematic pleasures than watching Dr. Jones sock fascists on the jaw, the Nazis are more than a little overplayed as villains in wider Indiana Jones media. They're the safe default, like stormtroopers in Star Wars or Russians in James Bond. At the end of the day, the only prerequisite for being an Indiana Jones villain is a desire to exploit history and its treasures in some capacity. And while the Nazis are particularly infamous for being vandals of history, they aren't the only option. Dragging them back for a story set in 1969 felt like a lack of inspiration more than anything. However, I've never been happier to be wrong, because Dial of Destiny makes better use of its Nazi villains than just about any Indy adventures since Raiders of the Lost Ark, perfectly capturing why, despite so many other options for antagonists, this series keeps coming back to these goose-stepping morons. Something the film does especially well is framing the Nazis as the antithesis of everything Indy stands for. Across the previous films, we've come to understand Indy as a kind of protector of history. In the words of Indy's compatriot Basil Shaw, they simply want to save history. He hunts for ancient relics because he believes they belong in a museum. Museum being shorthand for preservation and public exhibition. History, and the art and artifacts that connect us to it, belongs to everyone, not some miserly collector, and least of all Adolf Hitler, and Indy fights to ensure it stays that way. As you might imagine, the Nazis are the polar opposite. They seek to control, exploit, and hoard history, something Dial of Destiny's prologue wastes no time reminding us. Dropping us in the midst of the Allied incursion into Nazi Germany, the first thing Mangold shows us is the Nazis ransacking their own fortress, piling as much of the ill-gotten loot as they can carry onto a train in a desperate attempt to keep it out of Allied hands. This whole sequence is dripping with disdain for the way the Nazis treat these relics. Castle walls stripped bare and floors littered with crates of art frame the effort as an act of desperation by a malignant entity more concerned with maintaining possession of their loot than protecting it. It all feels tantamount to the desecration of something sacred, a sentiment only amplified by the treatment of the Lance of Longinus, aka the spear that pierced Christ's blood or whatever during the crucifixion. It's a holy relic. Amidst their efforts to cling to their spoils, the Nazis are also searching for the fabled lance so they can deliver it to Hitler, who covets its power to alter fate. However, when this relic turns out to be fake, the Nazis seemingly lose interest in it immediately, further exemplifying their view that history is only valuable in so much as it is exploitable. But beyond their function as a foil to Indy's philosophy on history, the real genius of bringing the Nazis back in Dial of Destiny is how they personify one of the film's core thematic ideas, the futility of trying to live in the past. Nowhere is this more evident than in the primary antagonist of the film, Jürgen Wöhler, a former Nazi physicist living in America under the pseudonym Professor Schmidt. Wöhler was brought over after the war to work for NASA as a part of Operation Paperclip, an effort by the US government to recruit Nazi scientists before the Soviets could. The incorporation of Operation Paperclip into Wöhler's backstory smartly roots the reuse of Nazis in a historical context, drawing on a shameful and seldom acknowledged piece of American history, while also playing to contemporary concerns about the resurgence of fascism around the world. True to his regressive ideology, Wöhler embodies a corrosive nostalgia. He is consumed with the past, refusing to accept the outcome of the war. As a result, he's a man displaced in time, convinced that the post-war world the Allies have built no longer cares about men like him, a particularly overt dog whistle for white men. Throughout the film, Wöhler barely attempts to disguise his contempt for America's relative cultural pluralism, condescending to a black waiter in the hotel and attempting to manipulate Agent Mason, one of the federal agents assigned to shadow him. Likewise, he displays utter disregard for the democratically elected government he serves, blowing off the president and instructing his inner circle of Nazi stooges to circumvent the authority of his government handlers. Something the trigger-happy American on his crew, Klauber, relishes. Although we never really learn how this American Nazi became involved with Wöhler, his constant reference to Wöhler as the professor suggests he was recruited during Wöhler's time as a professor at the University of Alabama. Klauber is one of the few elements of the film I would have liked to have seen expanded on, because what's most interesting about him is the way his presence adds dimension to the Dial of Destiny's depiction of Nazism. While there were non-German Nazis in Raiders and Last Crusade, Belloc and Donovan are shown to be opportunists willing to lie down with fascists to get what they want, but not committed to the cause. But Klauber, well, that guy's a true believer for sure, emphasizing the fact that Nazism is an ideology that extends well beyond Germany's borders. Even more interestingly, the Belloc-Donovan role of an opportunist willing to lie down with the Nazis is this time filled by the US government, who tries to appease Wöhler to get what they want, in this case help developing the Apollo rocket. And they are repaid for their cynicism with a swift and violent betrayal once Wöhler no longer needs them. Voller is, in many ways, the uber-Nazis, the final evolution of the evil Indy has spent his life confronting, so fanatically devoted to an ideology of narrowly defined purity that even Hitler himself does not live up to his standards. Voller cannot accept that Nazism failed, instead insisting that it was failed. Specifically, it was failed by the Führer, who doomed the cause by provoking war. He is so fixated on this defeat that he has dedicated his entire life to correcting it, the only way a Nazi knows how, by rewriting history. But unlike real-world Nazis, Voller doesn't have to just settle for rhetoric, violence, and the suppression of information. He seeks the means to quite literally correct history by traveling back to before the outbreak of war to kill Hitler. Fittingly, the means to this end is the exploitation of a Greco-Roman relic, the very cultures co-opted by the Nazi Party to ground their horrific ideology in history. The relic in question is the central MacGuffin of the film, the mythic Dial of Archimedes. Like the MacGuffins of the previous entries, the dial is suitably rooted in a historical context, a fictionalized version of the oldest computing device in history, the Antikythera mechanism, an object believed to have been designed by the Greek mathematician Archimedes of Syracuse. Embellishing on the dial's function to track and predict astronomical phenomena, the film supposes it was in fact designed to mathematically pinpoint fissures in time that, if passed through, could transport users to a different point in time. The Indy films are no stranger to the supernatural, but time travel is a fairly out there concept, even by their standards. Much like the interdimensional beings in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, it's a concept that skews more towards science fiction than the religious mysticism of the original 3 films. But where Dial of Destiny succeeds is in how it executes this fantastical idea, framing the dial more like a compass, guiding users to a naturally occurring phenomena which they must then pass through in order to travel through time. There's a tactile, analog quality to the time travel that grounds it in the low-tech aesthetic of Indy's world. Doc Brown's DeLorean, this is not. True to the hubris inherent in Nazism, Voller overestimates his own mastery of the device. For all his bluster about how the dial obeys the laws of physics and mathematics, his supposed areas of expertise, Voller misses the obvious historical context of the dial's creation. Archimedes couldn't have observed continental drift, therefore making the dial's calculations inaccurate. He can't conceive of history's utility as anything more than an ideological tool, and that oversight costs him dearly. Overshooting his target by over 2,000 years, the Nazi are flung into the Battle of Syracuse in 214 BC, where in a frenzied panic, they start doing exactly what Nazis always do: desecrating history, raining hellfire down on the very culture they purport to revere. The pandemonium of this moment is a highlight of the film, with Voller's existential dread upon realizing he may die in this dustbin of history as his compatriots are slaughtered around him. The Nazis of Dial of Destiny are short-sighted, violent thugs who would sooner wage war on the past than cede it to someone else. And in the end, they die pathetic deaths, having lost control over the history they sought to bend to their will. But Voller and the Nazis aren't the only ones unable to let go of the past. Like them, Indy is also consumed by an unhealthy nostalgia, pining for a time that has passed him by. Dial of Destiny communicates the importance of time right off the bat by setting the prologue in Indy's prime, courtesy of a de-aging technique. More than a mere fan-servicey indulgence, the film uses this rare glimpse of the past to bolster its narrative focus on the passage of time. While the effect isn't always convincing, the sequence successfully evokes the adventures of Indy's past, so that when we change gears and time period, the contrast between the Indy we knew and the Indy we meet is stark. By 1969, years and the mileage have seemingly caught up to Indy, visibly weathered by time, sleeping alone in his recliner after having drank himself to sleep the night before, dressed in nothing but his boxer shorts. Like Voller, Indy is fixated on a loss he wishes he could change, but unlike the Nazi, the loss isn't political but personal. The loss of his son Mutt, who who was killed in Vietnam, only having joined in spite of his father. This loss has destroyed Indy's marriage to Marion. The decision to kill off Mutt has proven oddly controversial since the film's release, with some critics likening it to a blood sacrifice, killing Kingdom of the Crystal Skull's most divisive new character as a new kind of narrative penance for the film. And while I won't assume to know what was in James Mangold's heart when he committed to this decision, I think the choice ultimately makes sense for the story he and Harrison Ford set out to tell. For starters, Mutt simply couldn't return. I don't know when the last time you Googled Shia LaBeouf was, but the dude was never going to be in this film. If Shia's shitty attitude towards Spielberg following Crystal Skull's release wasn't enough to rule out the triumphant return of Mutt Williams, his public meltdown and alleged domestic violence definitely sealed the deal. So in making Indy 5, the filmmakers were left with a Mutt-sized problem. He was a major player in the last film and is Indy and Marion's son, so you can't discard him entirely. You could try explaining away his absence by saying he's off-screen somewhere doing his thing, but that feels off. The revelation that Mutt was Indy's son was a key part of Indy's journey in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. The character represents the things Indy thought he would never get to have: a family. So having him just be off-screen would have felt like an attempt to undermine the previous film. Not only that, but it would waste the dramatic potential presented by his absence. From the outset, the intention in making a fifth Indy film was to wrap up Indy's journey by telling a story about a hero in Twilight. And what better way into that idea than by disrupting the domestic life he built for himself at the end of the previous film? Killing Mutt isn't a mean-spirited solution to a logistical production problem, it's a way to expose Indy's soul, a decision that honors the character's importance in the previous story while finding an interesting way to tell a new story without him. And to those who would argue that having Indy and Marion losing their son means the story denies Indy a happy ending, that is exactly the idea the film intends to explore. Can Indy, having lost the family he thought he'd never get to have, ever come back? Or is he doomed to wallow in the pain of that loss indefinitely, consumed by regret and pushing people away? Meanwhile, the world outside his domestic nightmare has seemingly moved on without him. The thing he has devoted his entire life to, the preservation of history, seems of little interest to an upcoming generation more fixated on making their own history. Indy and his generation fought to prevent societal regression at the hands of the Nazi, to essentially preserve the world, and now, as a result of their victory, the next generation has become focused on defining its future rather than worrying about the past. Moreover, the example set by the previous generation in winning the war against fascism has demonstrated the power people have to change the world for good, setting a standard that the next generation has embraced, standing up to unjust wars while fighting for a better world. But this apathy for history in a classroom has taken a toll on Indy. He's disengaged. Once enraptured students are barely able to stay awake in his lectures as he half-heartedly spoon-feeds them information from his slides like every bad professor you've ever had in college. Indy has been defeated by the passage of time and has resigned himself to dwelling on the past at the expense of the present. He's immersed himself in history, but is unable to reconcile his place in it, not even seeming to realize the fact that he is living through one of history's greatest moments, the Apollo 11 mission. Unlike the relics he spent his life chasing, the past he holds on to is intangible, forever destined to slip through his fingers like sand. Yet, he still tries to hold on regardless, clinging to tokens of regret like his wedding ring and the photo of Marion on his fridge, while discarding any and all reminders that time is moving on, like the clock he's gifted upon his retirement, which he promptly unloads on a random passerby on the street. When asked about what he would do with the power to travel through time, Indy gives a very telling response, explaining he would try to dissuade Mutt from enlisting. While this is an understandable sentiment from a grieving father, it illustrates Indy's inability to deal with his grief. Rather than working through his pain in a healthy way, his mind is still caught in the past, still lingering on regret, the things he should have said to make things right, rather than the things he could be doing in the present to get through what has happened. Like Voller, the prospect of time travel only exacerbates Indy's unhealthy relationship to the past, fueling the notion that he could have made things right. A toxic thought that ensures closure will continue to elude him. So, when Indy is thrust through the time fissure at the climax of the film, his unwillingness to engage in the present is literalized, giving him the means to physically escape into the past he's been mentally trapped in the entire film. In a lot of ways, this feels like a logical endpoint for Indy's personal relationship with history. In The Last Crusade, we learned that Indy's passion for archaeology stemmed from a desire to get his father's attention, a childhood spent bringing him relics like the Cross of Coronado in the hopes that it would earn his approval. Through these attempts to win his father's affection, Indy found his own sense of purpose, protecting history, a mission he would go on to devote his entire life to. But that mission merely filled a void. So it makes perfect sense that when presented with the opportunity to retreat into history, to soothe his broken heart and be surrounded by the thing he has spent his entire life protecting, he would opt to take it. Because, in a way, that's what he's always done. But to stay would not only be an admission of defeat, but more significantly, a betrayal of his devotion to history. Early into the film, Indy asks his students a simple question: how do we know history happened if we aren't there to see it? The answer to the question is remarkably simple: through what remains. Relics like Archimedes' dial or the Ark of the Covenant. The film argues these objects prove history, thereby implying that it's the work of archaeologists to selflessly protect those remnants and share them with the world so that they can continue to be remembered. We see this idea expressed most clearly through Sala, who Indy helped relocate to America during the war. For Sala, it's important that his grandchildren know their history as both Americans and Egyptians, to preserve that connection to their culture through its history. It's also important to them to keep personal history alive, as we see in the closing moments of the film when Sala recounts the events of raiders to his grandchildren, ensuring that piece of history is preserved. In a meta way, this speaks to the importance of keeping the stories and films we love alive, by passing them down to our children and grandchildren, for them to be inspired by these stories and then go on and have adventures and stories of their own that they can then share one day. If Indy stays, he would be putting himself over this mission of preservation, altering history irrecoverably to satisfy his own needs. So this is the choice Indy has to make at the end of Dial of Destiny, to save history one more time by denying himself the chance to escape into it. But even when confronted with that fact, Indy can't bring himself to make the hard choice. How could he? He is talking to Archimedes, a man whose work he has admired from a distance his entire life, amidst a battle he has studied over and over again. For a man who has lost so much, it's too much to ask. But luckily, the burden is taken off of his shoulders when his goddaughter, Helena Shaw, knocks him out and brings him back to the present. In the end, the depression Indy almost succumbs to can only be broken by radical intervention. Indy's place is in the present, but it's only by being dragged back and surrounded by the family he didn't realize he had that he's finally able to recognize that and come back emotionally, reconciling with Marion by sharing their pain rather than disappearing into it. In one of the most beautiful sequences and line deliveries ever in these films. Like, it's just so good. The "Are you back, Indy?" question is one of the most amazing lines. I just melt every time. It brings me to tears. It's such a great line. Indy's unhealthy obsessions with the past throughout Dial of Destiny speak to a broader theme of obsession. In a way, it's a theme that every Indiana Jones film has touched on to some extent, most notably Last Crusade, which dealt with Henry Jones's obsession with finding the Holy Grail. And much like that film, Dial of Destiny argues that the only way out of those kind of obsessions is by cultivating healthy interpersonal relationships. This idea is made clear in the way Helena is able to save Indy from his obsession at the climax of the film, but this relationship is counterbalanced through Indy's relationship with Helena's father, Basil. Following his experience in the film's prologue, Basil becomes fixated on finding the Dial of Archimedes, an obsession that consumes him. Basil's obsession answers an interesting idea that I'm honestly surprised none of the previous films have asked. How does traveling with Indiana Jones impact the lives of his associates after the adventure ends? On these adventures, Indy and his compatriots encounter things that defy explanation. How would that change you? Dial of Destiny suggests, yeah, there'd be a lot to process. Basil's experience in 1944 changes the trajectory of his entire life, sparking an obsession that causes him to lose his grip on reality. He starts behaving erratically to the point where it starts to scare his daughter, prompting an intervention by Indy. After several allusions to the confrontation in dialogue between Indy and Helena, Mangold finally shows us this moment while Indy is en route to Morocco, cleverly subverting the expected visual language of an Indiana Jones film to convey the discomfort of the intervention. We fade into this moment in place of the usual red line on a map that typically accompanies travel in these movies. The scene itself is also a break from form, uncharacteristically domestic for one of these movies, playing a bit like one of Ford's iconic 90s thrillers like The Fugitive, with Indy confronting Basil in his tightly packed office. Indy tries his best to get through to his friend, but he's clearly not equipped to help. So instead, he opts to do what he does best: take the artifact and run. He convinces Basil to relinquish the dial and promises to destroy it in the hopes that will stop Basil's obsession, but it doesn't. So when he later learns that Basil continued to obsess until his death, Indy is confronted by the thought that, like with his son, he could have done more to help. He could have stuck around. This characterization of Indy as someone who struggles to stick around is in conversation with the way Indy has been depicted across the previous films. In The Last Crusade, we learn that Indy's commitment issues stem from his contentious relationship with his father, issues that have trickled down into all of his subsequent relationships. When things get tough, Indy bails, which we see again and again in his relationships with the women in his life, but Dial of Destiny supposes this has impacted his non-romantic relationships as well, whether it be with his son, who he was so at odds with he wound up going to war to spite him, or his friend Basil, who he's seemingly given up on due to feeling guilty for exposing him to the dial. This guilt is made manifest in Helena, who resents Indy for essentially abandoning her and her father despite his duty as a godfather to help. With no one to help, she took it upon herself to pore over her father's dial journals, memorizing them, presumably in hopes that completing his work might bring him some peace. But in the end, her father dies, having lost his mind. So when faced with the prospect of losing another father figure to an obsession at the film's climax, Helena reacts emotionally. Like Indy with Basil, she recognizes her part in putting Indy in this position, dragging him into the situation, and so she takes responsibility for that and drags him out. But unlike Indy, she sticks around after, where Indy, overcome with guilt, left Basil to wallow in his obsession. Helena tries to help him heal, reuniting him with Marion so he can finally overcome what's been holding him back. In more ways than one, Helena is framed as a younger Indy. Not because the film is setting her up to take over the franchise, although I'd be very happy to see this character again at some point, but rather in that she represents everything Indiana Jones once was. A jaded rogue more concerned with chasing fortune and glory than doing what's right. She's essentially Indy in Temple of Doom, before his experience at Pankot Palace forced him to grow beyond his single-minded pursuit of wealth and fame. Helena even has her own short round in the form of Teddy, a young street urchin that tags along on her misadventures. Dial of Destiny feels like something of a spiritual successor to Temple of Doom, which, if you know me, you know that Temple of Doom is my favorite Indiana Jones film, so I'm gonna eat that shit up. And this is mainly in how it differs tonally from the other adventures, and nowhere is this more apparent than in Helena's scenes. Her world feels like an extension of the world of Lao She and Club Obi-Wan we caught at the start of Doom, complete with a black market antique sale. Just as Indy likely wouldn't have wound up in India had he not gone into business with gangsters, Helena only finds herself embroiled in Waller's Nazi plot because she offered to sell him her father's dial before reneging on their deal because she thought she could get a better price. Likewise, had she not climbed into bed with a gangster, literally, she might have been able to retrieve the dial on the streets of Tangiers without her former fiancé undermining her attempts. Helena is more or less the daughter Indy never had, because although he didn't raise her, her presence, or rather lack thereof, in her life played a significant role in the person she became. Following a thrilling chase through Tangiers in the back of a tuk-tuk, Helena throws a couple jabs at Indy for his role in her turning out the way she did. After her father lost his mind, she had no other parental figure to turn to, so she became self-sufficient, mirroring Indy's own less-than-ideal childhood. Mangold hammers this idea home in the aforementioned flashback sequence. As Indy goes to leave the Shaw home, having retrieved the dial, a young Helena has a brief interaction with Indy while her father raves like a man possessed in the background. Mangold's camera holds on Helena's face as Indy pulls out, framing this moment as a kind of abandonment. Indy insists that her dad will be fine in a few days, but it's not clear that'll be the case, and you can see that fear on Helena's face. This shot then transitions beautifully into a reflection in the window of a plane before panning across to adult Helena on her way to Morocco to sell the dial piece, linking the past trauma to Helena's current behavior. It's a wonderful piece of visual storytelling that wordlessly conveys the experience that informs the character's greed. We get another great moment like this with Teddy in Sicily. Throughout the film, Teddy has been anxious to get back to the wheeling and dealing he and Helena got into prior to meeting Indy. Teddy's proudly in it for all the wrong reasons, and while sitting alone, we get an indication as to why. Overhearing some rich Italian kids mocking his less than well-to-so clothing, Teddy gets out of his way to pickpocket the kid and then use the money to buy himself a gelato. Like Helena, Teddy's greed is a response to his unstable home life. He's grown up poor and is self-conscious of the fact and is intent on lifting himself out of that situation. Indy serves as a contrast to their self-serving tendencies. While he used to be that guy, Indiana Jones has grown over the years. Instead of leaving a trail of enemies in his wake, Indy has friends like Sala or Ronaldo, people who are willing to put their neck out for him, not hunt him down because of some transgression. And through spending time together, Indy draws this quality out in Helena. Early in the film, she leaves Indy in the hands of the Nazis in Manhattan, but by the time she has another opportunity to leave Indy behind with the eels and make off with the Graphicos, she chooses to come back for him. Moreover, when the Nazis attempt to buy her help to decipher Archimedes' code aboard the boat, she plays into her past behavior to throw them off the scent and buy herself time to mount an escape using a stick of dynamite. What's so refreshing about Helena is the way she's allowed to grow into a more moral person without losing her edge. The filmmakers allow her to develop a conscience while remaining flirty and rough around the edges, a privilege rarely afforded to female action heroes. As a result, when Helena saves Indy from himself at the end of the film, it doesn't feel condescending, like a perfect character teaching a grumpy old man a lesson. Rather, it feels like repaying a favor. Indy may have made Helena the person she was, but he also helped make her the person she has become over the course of the film. And that perspective that he has given her empowers her to stop Indy from making the same mistakes she's been making by giving in to his selfishness. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Man, it's a film that shouldn't work, so I really can't blame people for being cynical, but I think when you look under the hood, it's something really, really special. Every aspect of this film feels designed with love and care. The film is chock full of little details. Every narrative decision and payoff, from Helena's cavalier morality to the lighter Indy uses to set fire to the Graphicos, is given a thoughtful setup. Every action beat is exhilarating and propels the story forward, and every character, no matter how minor, feels essential. Prior to making Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, Steven Spielberg had considered moving on from the series, falling back into an executive producing role and handing the reins to a younger director who could bring to the film a passion he no longer could. Kind of like what Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell wound up doing with the Evil Dead franchise. While Spielberg ended up making Indy 4, that vision for the future of the series has come to fruition with Dial of Destiny. You could say that it was the destiny of this franchise. As I said before, James Mangold is no Spielberg, but the end result is a film Spielberg couldn't have made. Not just because his heart was no longer in films of this kind, but because of his proximity to the material. Crystal Skull buckled under the weight of an unclear vision for the project, caught between two creatives who couldn't decide whether the film should take big swings or pay tribute to what came before. As a result, the final product does neither effectively. But Dial of Destiny threads that needle in a way that seems effortless, paying homage to the works that preceded it, while taking Indy somewhere he's never gone before: forward. While Mangold's position as a fan puts him at greater risk of becoming blinded by reverence, it also gives him perspective, enough to rip the Band-Aid off and not only push Indy into a world that no longer needs him, but have him grow to accept that fact. Because while the world doesn't need an Indy stuck in the past, we'll always need heroes like him in the present, even if it's just to say one last goodbye.